July 1944. The Texas night was thick with heat, and the hum of cicadas, the air hanging like gauze over the rows of barbed wire. In the distance, the faint smell of mesquite smoke drifted through the camp. Then, a sharp mechanical click cut across the darkness. A whir began, rhythmic and insistent. Heads turned toward the far end of the compound, where a pale beam of light pierced the black sky, slicing through dust motes that shimmered like drifting stars. The American guards were setting up the projector again. Inside the wire, hundreds of German prisoners, soldiers of the Reich, gathered in cautious silence. They had seen many strange things since their capture in Normandy and North Africa, but this was something else. Beneath a fluttering American flag, chairs and benches had been dragged into rows. A sheet was strung between two poles, their makeshift cinema. The smell of warm soil mixed with the faint scent of popcorn from the guard station. Friedrich Adler, once a Luftwaffe officer, stood in the shadows of the crowd, his eyes, weary and uncertain, fixed on the beam. He remembered floodlights of another kind, those that scoured night skies over Hamburg, those that blinded prisoners in interrogation rooms. But this light seemed different, softer, purposeful. When the reels began to spin, the first frame flared to life. Humphrey Bogart, face half-lit, standing in a smoky Casablanca cafe. Laughter rippled through the Americans watching nearby. Then, slowly, the Germans began to react. Hesitant smiles, curious murmurs, even awe. For the first time in years, they were witnesses, not combatants. The desert wind tugged at the sheet, and the flickering shadows played over their faces, each one briefly illuminated by an image of another world. Friedrich felt something shift deep within him, a quiet disbelief at the ease, the abundance, the strange intimacy of American storytelling. It wasn't propaganda or command. It was emotion, unguarded and human. Around him, the prisoners leaned forward unconsciously, drawn toward the light that danced across wire and sand. Before we move deeper into this forgotten story, subscribe to POW Tales, where real history speaks. The context begins where the projector's light first touched those faces, inside the barbed wire world of Texas's POW camps. The Texas plains stretched endlessly, a sun-baked expanse of sand, mesquite, and the occasional grove of pecan trees. Hidden within this landscape, surrounded by fences and watchtowers, were some of the largest German POW camps in the United States. By 1944, America held more than 425,000 German prisoners in 46 states, and Texas, with its ample space and sparse population, became home to thousands clustered in camps like Hearne, Camp Huntsville, and Camp Livingston. The camps were designed with a combination of pragmatism and ideology. Soldiers were housed in long wooden barracks, separated into compounds, each patrolled by armed guards, yet the overall aim was not cruelty, but containment and, increasingly, moral engagement. Life in Texas camps was carefully structured. Prisoners rose at dawn, performed routine inspections, and moved in formation to labor assignments, often in agriculture. The U.S. War Department recognized early that work could serve dual purposes: practical contributions to the war economy and a mechanism for soft re-education. Diaries and letters from Hearne reveal a repetitive rhythm: planting, harvesting, irrigating, that was designed to keep men occupied while exposing them to the norms of American life. At the same time, the environment emphasized humane treatment. Red Cross inspections noted that barracks were ventilated, mess halls offered regular meals, and medical attention was prompt. Prisoners were allowed correspondence with home, church attendance, and modest recreational activities. Among these recreational measures, cultural exposure became a priority. Commanders and psychologists alike understood that German prisoners had been steeped in Nazi propaganda for years. Encouraging leisure activities that demonstrated American normalcy, music, sports, and notably film, could gradually recalibrate perception. Camp newsletters, sometimes written by the prisoners themselves, began to document weekly concerts, baseball games, and theatrical performances. The rhythm of these events introduced a surprising element of choice. Men could attend or abstain, yet the very act of presenting these options subtly undermined rigid indoctrination. By the summer of 1944, weekly movie screenings were formally integrated into camp schedules. The War Department issued memoranda instructing officers to provide films deemed morally instructive and entertaining, emphasizing that these screenings were not simply for diversion, but part of a broader strategy to expose prisoners to the language, humor, and social norms of America. Letters home, censored though they were, hint at the prisoners' astonishment. One Luftwaffe officer wrote, "We sit in darkness, yet see more of this land than any report could convey. The films are strange, yet vivid. We are unsure whether to laugh or to think." The screenings became a nightly ritual, a rare window into a world untouched by conflict and fear. The physical setup of the screenings reflected both ingenuity and resourcefulness. Sheets were strung across open courtyards, projectors mounted on wheeled platforms, and benches arranged to mimic theaters. Guards sometimes offered popcorn or soda, though in minimal quantities, creating a paradoxical intimacy. Prisoners were simultaneously supervised and invited into a space of leisure. Reports from camp administrators described moments when laughter or applause seemed to bridge the divide between captive and captor, revealing an unexpected vulnerability in men conditioned to suspicion. This combination of labor, recreation, and observation set the stage for profound psychological shifts. Prisoners were learning, consciously or not, to reconcile their previous training with the reality of life in an abundant, orderly, and surprisingly humane society. Every frame of a projected movie, every shadow cast by the flickering light, carried the potential to reshape understanding. It was here, under the Texas stars, in the quiet of evenings filled with images of another world, that the prisoners' perceptions began to shift, and the seeds of moral and emotional transformation were quietly sown. As the weeks passed, the initial novelty of film screenings evolved into a central feature of camp life. The reels rotated weekly, alternating between comedies, dramas, and newsreels. Prisoners marveled at the technical sophistication, the smooth movement of the projector, the crispness of the images, and the orchestration of sound that seemed to carry effortlessly across the courtyard. Many officers had never experienced cinema outside of propaganda films shown in Germany, and the contrast was striking. Letters and diaries from Camp Herne describe moments of quiet disbelief as prisoners observed scenes of domestic life, families laughing at a dinner table, children playing freely, couples dancing, worlds that had seemed distant, almost fictional, from the battlefields of Europe. War Department memoranda from mid-1944 indicate that these screenings were more than entertainment. Officers were instructed to note reactions, particularly the prisoners' engagement with American values as depicted on screen: cooperation, humor, ingenuity, and resilience. Reports emphasized that the goal was subtle, to allow prisoners to internalize unfamiliar norms without coercion. One declassified file recounts a conversation in which a camp psychologist observed, "The projection of light and narrative captivates attention. Laughter and silence alike become instruments of comprehension. Men who resist ideology often cannot resist story." For prisoners like Friedrich Adler, the experience was disorienting. He had been trained to view the enemy with suspicion, yet here were Americans offering leisure, civility, and the illusion of choice, all under the same sun and sky that had scorched him during labor. The evolution of these programs mirrored broader propaganda strategies. Early attempts at ideological instruction, lectures on democracy, pamphlets, and mandatory attendance at camp meetings had met resistance. Film screenings succeeded where these failed because they were immersive, voluntary, and emotionally resonant. Prisoners began to compare what they saw on screen with their lived experience: clean barracks, timely meals, courteous guards. Humor in comedies sparked awkward laughter. Depictions of problem-solving in dramas prompted whispered discussions. Scenes of teamwork or kindness elicited both envy and admiration. The contrast was undeniable. Letters smuggled or lightly censored reveal how prisoners articulated their shock. One entry reads, "We are shown a world of freedom, laughter, and ease. It is at once foreign and intoxicating. I cannot reconcile it with what we were taught to believe about America." Another observes the power of technical skill. The projector moves with such precision. The images leap. The sound is exact. Perhaps their machines, like their society, are as advanced as they say. Even the act of gathering under a sheet, the collective watching of light and shadow, began to foster a shared sense of reflection and community among men who had spent months in regimented isolation. By mid-1944, camp administrators began to notice measurable changes. Prisoners displayed greater cooperation during labor assignments, fewer conflicts arose, and morale improved. Psychologists and officers attributed this in part to the immersive power of cinema. The bright beam, cutting across the Texas night, became more than a form of distraction. It was an agent of cultural transmission. Even minor details, the placement of benches, the angle of the projector, the careful timing of sound, were calibrated to maximize attention and absorption. In the quiet of the camp, after reels had stopped and the projector was dismantled for the night, prisoners often lingered in small groups, discussing characters, plot twists, and the peculiar customs depicted on screen. These discussions, often in whispered German, revealed curiosity, introspection, and the faint stirrings of ideological reconsideration. The images had bridged distance, ideology, and expectation, creating a fertile ground for moral and emotional shifts. By the time Friedrich and his fellow POWs returned to their barracks, the flickering light had left more than shadows on the ground. It had illuminated the cracks in their preconceptions, exposing vulnerabilities in belief and opening the way for deeper reflection. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible turning of the mind, one that would prepare them for the descent into wonder, doubt, and eventual transformation. The next evening, as the sun sank behind the Texas horizon and the projector whirred to life once again, the prisoners would step into that light and into a world they had never imagined. August 1944. The heat of the Texas evening lingered even as the sun fell behind the low, flat horizon. Dust rose in faint eddies along the edges of the courtyard, catching the last gold of daylight. The projector's hum began before the first flicker of light appeared on the torch sheet, a sound both mechanical and strangely inviting. Prisoners shuffled into place, carrying blankets or leaning on the shoulders of comrades. Friedrich Adler felt the familiar tension in his chest, a combination of expectation and unease. This was not the battlefield. There were no orders, no formations, no enemy fire. Yet the anticipation was almost as acute. As the reel clicked into motion, the first frames danced across the sheet. Wide streets, laughter, sunlight bouncing off facades. The Germans were silent at first, eyes squinting against the flicker. Some had never experienced such vivid motion outside of propaganda reels or training films. The contrast was electric. In a corner, a young soldier muttered, "It cannot be real." Friedrich's own eyes widened, drawn to the spontaneity of movement, the careful gestures of actors, the rhythm of dialogue that felt alive rather than rehearsed for indoctrination. The initial tension gave way to a mix of reactions. Laughter, hesitant but growing, rippled through the crowd. Some men smiled, not understanding the jokes fully, but responding to the laughter around them. Others averted their eyes, uncomfortable with the freedom on display. There was something disarming about American films. They were simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary. Scenes of families sharing meals, children running through parks, men solving problems with ingenuity. These images pierced the rigid expectations ingrained by years of military discipline and Nazi ideology. Friedrich noticed the projector's beam cutting through the night like a sword of light. Shadows from the sheet played across the faces of prisoners, revealing emotions unspoken for months: awe, confusion, curiosity, and even envy. The light became a motif, a tangible reminder of a world beyond the fences. Unlike the harsh glare of searchlights or the clinical brightness of inspection lamps, this light invited observation without coercion. It was illuminating in the literal and metaphorical sense, revealing corners of thought long neglected. As the story on the screen unfolded, Friedrich felt a pull between disbelief and engagement. He watched characters navigate problems with wit, kindness, and humor, traits he had rarely encountered in the rigid hierarchy of military life. Each scene forced him to reconcile his expectations with what he saw: abundance without exploitation, laughter without derision, ingenuity without cruelty. The gulf between ideology and reality yawned wide, and for the first time, he allowed himself to question the truths he had accepted without hesitation. The camp itself seemed to transform under the projector's glow. The barbed wire faded into darkness. The guards became peripheral figures, and the courtyard turned into a shared arena of reflection. Men whispered softly to one another during pauses, commenting on character actions or plot points. Friedrich noticed that even those who initially resisted were drawn back by the rhythm of storytelling, by the compelling human drama unfurling in front of them. By the final scenes, the prisoners were leaning forward unconsciously, absorbed not merely in plot, but in the demonstration of human resilience. The juxtaposition of conflict and resolution, despair and hope, mirrored their own inner contradictions. The descent into wonder and moral reconsideration had begun. The projector's beam, flickering across their faces, became both guide and mirror, illuminating the tension between past loyalties and emerging understanding. As the final credits rolled and the projector wound down, Friedrich lingered, staring at the lingering glow. He felt the first stirrings of transformation, an unease tempered by fascination. The light had revealed more than a story. It had revealed the fragility of certainty and the possibility of change. The evenings that followed carried a growing, ritualistic weight. Each screening became an event not only of entertainment, but of quiet education, a slow and subtle induction into an unfamiliar culture. Friedrich Adler noticed patterns emerging, the way men shifted in their seats to follow the flicker, how some whispered interpretations while others simply stared, absorbed by the strange combination of motion, sound, and story. Each frame carried layers of meaning, layering moral insight atop mere amusement. It was during a showing of Stagecoach that Friedrich first recognized the depth of the shift, the characters' resourcefulness and loyalty, their ingenuity in navigating danger without resorting to cruelty, struck a chord. He glanced at his comrades. Some laughed openly, others frowned in confusion, but all were pulled toward the light, unwilling to look away. The projector's beam cut across their faces like a lighthouse over turbulent waters, revealing both hope and dissonance. It illuminated what they had been taught to disdain: human ingenuity, resilience, and ethical nuance. Friedrich began keeping a small sketchbook in his bunk, a quiet record of what he observed. He drew the projector, the sheet, and the way the light spilled over the sandy courtyard, breaking the monotony of the camp's nightly darkness. He documented reactions, a subtle furrow of a brow, a reluctant smile, a whispered exclamation, trying to capture the emotional currents that movies had begun to stir. In these sketches, the motif of light became central, a thin, purposeful beam that cut through darkness, connecting the mundane and the extraordinary, the captive and the free. The psychological impact was palpable. Officers who had arrived rigid and suspicious began to display curiosity, asking questions about plot points or cultural references. A younger soldier, who had barely spoken since capture, laughed so freely during a comedic scene that it startled everyone around him. Even the guards, watching from a respectful distance, noted a change in demeanor. The prisoners moved with slightly less tension, their eyes lighter, their gestures less constrained. This was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable. Letters sent home, carefully censored, of course, hinted at evolving thought. One officer wrote, "We watch these films, and our hearts stir in ways we cannot name. It is a world that seems both unreal and inevitable, a place where men live and suffer and laugh without orders or fear." Another noted the technical prowess of the Americans. Their machines move like living creatures, smooth and relentless, as if the stories themselves are propelled by unseen hands. These observations revealed a dual astonishment at the foreignness of the culture and at the human capacity to evoke empathy, curiosity, and moral reconsideration. Over weeks, Friedrich noticed his own worldview fracturing. The rigid narratives of duty, loyalty, and enemy caricature had begun to crack. The screenings were no longer a diversion. They were a subtle interrogation of his own convictions. He began discussing plot points with other prisoners in low tones, analyzing character choices and debating ethical dilemmas presented on screen. It was a quiet, self-directed form of education, richer and more persuasive than any lecture or directive could have been. By the end of the month, the prisoners' nightly gatherings under the projector's glow had become a ritual of collective reflection. The descent into fascination, curiosity, and moral questioning was complete. The beam of light, initially a mere tool of entertainment, had become a guide, illuminating gaps in understanding, bridging the chasm between past indoctrination and emerging insight. With each flicker, each shadow cast over the wire and sand, Friedrich felt the growing possibility that captivity could teach not only endurance but perception, and that the human heart might be reshaped quietly by light, story, and observation. September 1944. The sun still pressed down on the Texas plains, but evenings brought a cooling relief. The rhythm of camp life had settled into a delicate, predictable pattern. Roll call at dawn, labor in fields or workshops, brief meals, and the endless shuffle between barracks and work details. Yet as predictable as the day had become, the nights introduced a subtle disruption: the weekly movie screenings. They had become the heartbeat of the camp, a shared ritual that shaped both time and mood. Friedrich Adler moved through the courtyard with measured steps. Men greeted one another with a quiet nod, a casual smile, or a whispered comment on the day's labor. Work had built discipline, but the screenings had built connection. The courtyard, previously just a space bounded by fences and watchtowers, transformed under the projector's beam into a forum for shared reflection. Even guards paused in their circuits to observe, though they rarely engaged. The presence of Americans, soldiers, technicians, or casual observers had become part of the background texture, neither threatening nor entirely absent. There was an odd humor in the routine. Prisoners traded cigarettes for better seats or blankets, jostled quietly for an advantageous spot on the benches, and occasionally teased one another about who would laugh first or shout out a line from a scene. Letters from the camp hint at these small rebellions against monotony, a soldier recounting how he mimicked a character's accent, or another noting that an improvised clap for a particularly clever scene earned him a grin from the nearest guard. These interactions, though minor, punctuated the long days with a human rhythm, distinct from orders and labor. Meals had become markers, rather than experiences. Prisoners ate quickly, often lingering in conversation about the films or the reactions of others. Friedrich found himself noticing subtleties: who smiled at the comedies, who flinched at tension, who whispered quietly to a neighbor. The projector's light had taught him observation, and he applied the skill everywhere: to the placement of tools in the workshop, the cadence of the cooks, the mannerisms of guards. Everyday life became a study in human behavior, a continuation of the lessons first illuminated under the flickering beam. Evening screenings introduced a communal pause, a counterpoint to the mechanized repetition of labor. The projector whirred to life, dust motes danced in its glow, and the prisoners settled into the familiar rhythm of attention and reflection. There was laughter, sometimes reluctant. There were murmurs of understanding. There were moments of silence that carried their own weight. In this shared observation, the men began to glimpse humanity beyond borders and ideology, a fragile revelation carried on celluloid. Friedrich began to record more diligently in his sketchbook. The projector, the sheet, the beam of light stretching over wire and sand, and the reactions of his fellow prisoners became recurring subjects. Each entry was a meditation. The light revealed faces, expressions, and fleeting gestures, capturing a spectrum of human emotion that daily labor often concealed. The sketches were not merely art, they were a study in psychology, a visual diary of subtle transformations. This routine, repetitive yet enlivening, instilled a slow sense of normalcy. Prisoners came to anticipate the evenings, measuring the passage of weeks by the changing programs. The shared laughter, whispered commentary, and small human exchanges softened the starkness of captivity, creating a rhythm where the predictable labor of day and the illuminating ritual of night intertwined. As the projector dimmed and the men returned to their bunks, Friedrich's thoughts lingered on the flicker of light, the shared human responses, and the quiet revelations they had fostered. This pattern, repeated night after night, was quietly reshaping perceptions, preparing the prisoners for a turning point that none could yet foresee. By mid-September, the routine of work and film had become inseparable. Days were measured in physical exertion, mending fences, tending small vegetable plots, repairing equipment, while nights offered mental and emotional labor. Friedrich found himself analyzing every detail of the films, the cadence of dialogue, the gestures of characters, the interplay of light and shadow. The courtyard had become a theater of subtle instruction, where observation was both necessity and pleasure. Small acts of camaraderie punctuated the evenings. Prisoners shared blankets to ward off the night chill, whispered translations of idioms they did not understand, and compared reactions to particularly clever scenes. Humor had emerged as a social lubricant. It cut through tension and created intimacy among men who, weeks before, had barely acknowledged one another. Guards, now almost part of the background scenery, occasionally nodded at an exchange or allowed small privileges, reinforcing a fragile but growing sense of trust. Friedrich's sketches became more detailed, capturing not only the physical layout of the courtyard, but also the emotional rhythms of the crowd. One drawing showed a group of men leaning forward, captivated by the screen. Another recorded a fleeting smile on a hardened officer's face. The beam of the projector, central to each composition, was always depicted cutting through darkness, a visual metaphor for perception and revelation. It was a motif that accompanied every action, linking labor, leisure, and reflection. Evening discussions after the screenings became subtle forums for moral and cultural exchange. Prisoners debated character choices, questioned ethical dilemmas presented on screen, and quietly compared American norms with their own experiences. One evening, a particularly moving scene depicting a family helping a stranger sparked a heated conversation about duty, empathy, and honor. These exchanges, though cautious and respectful, revealed cracks in rigid ideological frameworks, offering small yet persistent lessons in humanism and ethical reflection. Friedrich observed a change in morale across the camp. Men were more cooperative during work, less confrontational, and increasingly willing to engage in collective tasks. The screenings had become an instrument of subtle psychological restructuring, blending education, entertainment, and emotional recalibration. Even small gestures, a shared laugh, a whispered comment, or the careful passing of popcorn, reinforced community and diminished the alienation of captivity. The projection of light became a daily meditation, both literal and figurative. It reminded prisoners of the possibility of clarity and insight, even within the confining fences of the camp. For Friedrich, the motif evolved. It was no longer just the beam from a projector, but a symbol of curiosity, reflection, and moral awakening. He began to see that the routine of work, observation, and nightly screenings was shaping not only perception, but the capacity for empathy, understanding, and personal growth. As the final credits rolled one evening, Friedrich lingered on the courtyard's edge, watching shadows stretch across the sand. The men filed back to their barracks, quiet yet altered, carrying with them a new awareness of life beyond the camp's wire and gates. The rhythm of labor and projection had set the stage for the profound turning point that would challenge their assumptions, confront their beliefs, and illuminate the fragile humanity within. October 1944. The Texas air carried a faint chill as evening settled across the camp. Dust still clung to clothing and hair from a long day of labor, yet the prisoners moved toward the courtyard with anticipation rather than obligation. Tonight's screening was The Grapes of Wrath, a story unfamiliar to most, depicting hardship, resilience, and compassion in a world far removed from the sanitized narratives of war. The projector hummed to life, casting a sharp beam that cut through darkness and anticipation alike. Friedrich Adler found himself seated near the center, sketchbook at his side. The familiar rhythm of light and shadow began to envelop the courtyard, drawing eyes toward the sheet, drawing hearts toward reflection. At first, the men reacted as they always had: curious glances, quiet whispers, tentative smiles. But this film carried a weight unfamiliar to them. The depiction of poverty, migration, and human endurance struck chords they had not anticipated. They watched families struggle with empathy, not judgment. They saw resilience born of necessity, not command. As the story unfolded, murmurs circulated among small clusters of prisoners. "Why do they suffer so, yet remain kind?" one whispered. Another commented on the ingenuity of a character navigating scarcity with dignity. Friedrich noticed these conversations growing in intensity and depth, moving beyond plot to philosophy, morality, and reflection. It was no longer mere curiosity. It was confrontation with ethical realities he had been trained to ignore or dismiss. The beam of the projector became a conduit for revelation. Light, once simply illumination, now symbolized insight. Shadows cast over the barracks and sandy courtyard seemed to highlight the contrasts in the prisoners' own lives: indoctrination versus observation, duty versus empathy, rigidity versus moral choice. Friedrich sketched furiously, trying to capture not only the scene on the screen, but the reactions of his comrades, the subtle narrowing of eyes, the quiet swallowing of emotion, the hesitant nods of understanding. For some, the film was uncomfortable. Men who had once prided themselves on unwavering loyalty now squirmed under the glare of human complexity. The moral dilemmas on screen were mirrored internally. Friedrich felt the tension of questioning what he had believed to be absolute, confronting the fissures in ideology with the raw humanity portrayed before him. Laughter, once easy and unthinking, now interspersed with quiet sighs or thoughtful silence. The audience was not just watching, they were grappling. Letters later recovered from this period indicate the depth of transformation. One prisoner wrote, "We see a world where suffering and kindness coexist, where men must make choices not dictated by command. It is strange, unsettling, and enlightening." Another added, "The light on the sheet shows more than Americans. It shows ourselves, our assumptions, and our possibilities." The projection, initially entertainment, had become moral instruction without didactic force, a guide to perception and empathy. Even the guards sensed the shift. Previously rigid interactions softened. Men moved with less tension. Conversations between captors and prisoners grew more nuanced. The courtyard, once a place of surveillance and control, became a space of moral exploration, illuminated by celluloid, by conversation, and by the subtle glow of human understanding. As the final scene faded and the projector wound down, Friedrich remained seated, absorbing the aftermath of narrative and reflection. The turning point had arrived, a convergence of observation, empathy, and insight that would ripple beyond the courtyard, reshaping relationships, beliefs, and the capacity to perceive the world anew. The morning after the screening, the camp carried a different rhythm. Men moved through barracks and courtyards with subtle shifts in posture, gestures softened, conversations tinged with thoughtfulness. Friedrich noticed how the previous night's film had lingered. Small clusters discussed character choices, ethical dilemmas, and moments of kindness and ingenuity. The projector's light, though absent, had left a residue, a moral and emotional afterglow that refracted through daily life. Friedrich himself reflected deeply. The rigidity of ideology, once unshakable, now seemed brittle. He compared the ordered repetition of camp labor with the chaotic humanity on screen, noticing the disparity. American families had endured hardship, yet retained humor and compassion. Prisoners, too, had suffered, but often lacked language or permission to express empathy beyond the narrow parameters of duty. The juxtaposition unsettled him and sparked introspection. In small gatherings, men began sharing observations more openly. "Why do they laugh here, while we endure without?" asked one officer. Another countered, "Because they have freedom. The choice to act or not, to help or to withhold. We have been trained differently." These conversations, tentative yet persistent, signaled a quiet cultural and moral recalibration. The projector had become a teacher without voice. The screen, a mirror reflecting gaps in understanding, courage, and conscience. Friedrich's sketches evolved alongside thought. The light became more than a physical presence. It symbolized clarity and moral insight. He drew scenes of prisoners watching intently, capturing expressions that shifted from skepticism to engagement, from detachment to empathy. The motifs of flicker and shadow became metaphors for the internal struggle of understanding, of recognizing the humanity in those once deemed other. By mid-October, letters and camp reports confirmed the subtle yet measurable transformation. Men were more cooperative during labor, conflicts diminished, and small acts of kindness were quietly exchanged. A shared cigarette, a helping hand with chores, a whispered joke to ease tension. The films had instilled more than amusement. They had fostered ethical imagination. Prisoners were beginning to practice moral choices in small, human ways, testing responses within a controlled environment that mirrored larger ethical questions. Even the guards noted changes. Some remarked on the gentler tone of prisoner interactions, their willingness to assist one another without supervision, the emergence of trust in what had once been a strictly hierarchical and tense system. The beam of light from the projector, while no longer present during the day, had left a symbolic imprint. Illumination as guidance, observation as reflection, narrative as moral compass. The turning point solidified during one quiet night. Friedrich lingered after the credits alone on a bench, staring at the blank sheet. He traced the outline of the projected light in his mind, imagining how it had danced across faces, revealing subtle transformations, exposing vulnerabilities, and fostering empathy. He realized that captivity had not merely imposed obedience, but had, through light, story, and observation, cultivated reflection. The moral awakening was no longer theoretical. It had taken root in gestures, conversation, and thought. With each passing evening, each flicker of projected story, Friedrich felt the growing possibility that experience could reshape understanding, that observation could cultivate compassion, and that the smallest rituals, weekly movie screenings, whispered discussions, shared laughter, might ultimately redefine the boundaries of loyalty, duty, and humanity. The stage was now set for culmination. The collapse of war's rigid boundaries, the liberation of prisoners, and the final reckoning of lessons learned under the projector's glow. April 1945. The Texas air carried a coolness unfamiliar after months of sweltering heat. Rumors of the war's end drifted through the camp like whispers in the dark. German prisoners spoke in hushed tones of events far away. The Allied push into Germany, the fall of cities, the crumbling of the Reich. The familiar rhythm of labor and evening screenings persisted, yet beneath it ran a current of uncertainty and anticipation. Change was approaching, and even the barbed wire seemed less forbidding under the weight of history in motion. Friedrich Adler felt the tension keenly. The projector still sat in the corner of the courtyard, idle now, its mechanical hum replaced by the low murmur of speculation. Men compared letters from home, fragments of news, and rumors from returning labor details. They measured events through fragments of American newspapers or brief radio broadcasts filtered through the War Department. The war that had once defined them externally now threatened to redefine them internally. Their identities, once anchored in military hierarchy and ideology, were becoming fluid, unmoored by both circumstance and exposure to a world beyond the camp. The collapse of Germany was a double-edged revelation. It meant liberation from ideological demands and fear of retribution, but also confronted the prisoners with the consequences of defeat, ruined cities, lost families, and the impossibility of returning to the certainty of the past. Within the camp, this tension manifested in subtle ways. Men worked with a lighter hand, laughed more easily during chores, and spoke more openly about hopes and fears. Guards noticed fewer altercations, and a sense of fragile camaraderie had begun to replace the earlier rigidity of captivity. The courtyard, once the stage for weekly moral instruction, now bore witness to silent reflection. Men lingered where they had gathered for films, staring at the blank screen, as if expecting it to reveal their future. The projector's light, though dormant, lingered in memory, a metaphor for insight, observation, and the slow awakening of conscience. Friedrich sketched these moments: empty benches, shadows stretching across sand, the quiet faces of men reconciling defeat with moral reckoning. As April bled into May, the camp prepared for repatriation. Trucks arrived to transport men to ports of departure. Orders were issued and logistics coordinated. The tension in the air was palpable. Men whispered about the lives they would return to, the uncertainty of welcoming families, and the confrontation with a homeland in ruins. Some clung to the routines that had sustained them, while others felt an overwhelming sense of impermanence. For Friedrich, the end of captivity promised freedom, yet carried the weight of transformation that no battlefield had ever imposed. The motif of light continued to resonate. Reels that had once danced across faces now existed only in memory, yet their lessons endured. Projection had been more than visual entertainment. It had been the illumination of human complexity, morality, and possibility. Friedrich reflected on the irony. In a camp meant for containment, he and his comrades had been released into understanding, prepared for the moral and emotional challenges of a world reshaped by war. News arrived confirming Germany's surrender. The camp erupted in quiet, restrained celebration. Men shook hands, exchanged letters, and shared small tokens of memory. There were smiles, cautious laughter, and the tension of uncertainty interlaced with relief. The long arc of captivity, labor, routine, observation, and moral awakening was drawing to its decisive moment. The projectors were dismantled, the sheets taken down, and the courtyard emptied of its nightly congregation. Yet the lessons remained, ready to accompany the prisoners as they departed, carrying with them the flickering light of insight into the uncertain terrain of liberation. May 1945. Trucks rumbled across the camp, their engines stirring clouds of dust that clung to boots and blankets. The barbed wire fences, once symbols of containment, now felt oddly inert. Prisoners filed methodically toward the loading areas, carrying small bundles, letters, and the intangible weight of months spent under observation, labor, and moral reflection. Friedrich Adler paused at the edge of the courtyard, eyes tracing the familiar patterns of light and shadow left behind by the projector, now silent. The departure was orderly but emotionally charged. Men exchanged handshakes, whispered farewells, and cautious smiles. Bonds, forged in labor and reinforced under flickering beams of cinematic light, proved resilient, capable of carrying understanding beyond the fences of captivity. Even guards lingered briefly, offering nods that acknowledged more than duty, a recognition of transformation, shared in silence rather than words. For Friedrich, the journey to the port felt both literal and symbolic. Each mile carried him farther from the camp, yet closer to a confrontation with a homeland devastated by defeat. Letters and diaries spoke of cities bombed to rubble, families fractured, and the immense challenge of reintegration. Yet embedded in these anxieties was a subtle thread of hope, cultivated in the camp through ritual, observation, and moral awakening. The light of the projector had become a beacon of resilience, guiding men through uncertainty with the soft illumination of insight and reflection. As the ships prepared to cross the Atlantic, Friedrich thought back to the courtyard, the heat of the day, the whisper of wind through the mesquite, the mechanical whir of the projector, and the faint aroma of popcorn mingling with dust. Those small, ordinary details had become extraordinary in retrospect, shaping perception, empathy, and moral consciousness. The sequence of labor, routine, observation, and exposure had prepared men not merely for survival, but for understanding, offering a bridge between the world they had known and the world they would re-enter. Repatriation was more than physical movement. It was the resolution of a journey begun in confinement. Men reflected on choices, observed behavior, and quietly compared past assumptions with present insight. Conversations on deck of transport ships echoed the debates once whispered under the projection of light, ethical dilemmas, human ingenuity, and the capacity for kindness even amid destruction. The camp's lessons traveled with them, woven into gestures, discussions, and the careful calibration of thought in a world remade by war. By the time Friedrich set foot in Germany, the war had ended, yet its imprint lingered not only on landscapes, but on consciousness. He carried the memory of light over sand, of shared laughter and moral engagement, and of the subtle but profound shift from obedience to understanding. Each interaction upon return, with family, neighbors, and former comrades, bore traces of the ethical awareness cultivated under the Texas night sky. The human capacity for reflection, empathy, and transformation had been exercised quietly yet powerfully through months of captivity. As he walked through streets still scarred by conflict, Friedrich realized the paradox. Captivity had liberated more than physical bodies. It had opened minds to reflection, morality, and the fragile, enduring power of human connection. The motif of light, flickering, illuminating, transformative, persisted as a memory and a guide, tracing a path through uncertainty toward clarity and moral reckoning. The stage was now set for aftermath, reflection upon the journey, the consequences of experience, and the enduring impact of small acts that bridged confinement and liberation, summer 1945. Germany lay in ruins, a patchwork of bombed cities, disrupted families, and fractured communities. Friedrich Adler stepped carefully through streets lined with rubble, the scent of smoke and dust lingering in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of recently thawed earth and scattered crops. He had returned from Texas, a changed man, carrying memories that contrasted sharply with the devastation around him. The light of the projector, the flickering images of another world, the laughter and murmurs shared under the stars. All of it seemed almost unreal against the backdrop of ruin. In private moments, Friedrich reflected on the lessons learned in captivity. Work in the fields and workshops, the monotonous routines, the structured discipline, all had been framed by observation, small acts of empathy, and cultural exposure. He realized that the human heart could shift under sustained influence, that patterns of kindness, curiosity, and moral choice could grow even in unlikely soil. Prisoners like him had been offered glimpses of a different world, not through coercion, but through subtle, immersive engagement. Returning home, the contrast was stark. Streets were silent, where once they had thrummed with activity. Shops were shuttered, homes empty, families dispersed. Yet in the small interactions, Friedrich observed neighbors helping one another, children playing amid ruins, distant laughter. He recognized the faint echo of what he had witnessed under the flickering projection in Texas. Humanity persisted, resilient and patient, capable of continuity even amid the collapse of ideology and the destruction of war. Letters and diaries penned by fellow POWs documented similar revelations. One noted, "We were prisoners, yet we were taught freedom, compassion, and reflection. Returning, we carry these lessons, more enduring than any chain or barrier." Another wrote of the paradoxical beauty of captivity, the enforced routine, the observation of humanity at a remove, and the unexpected moral awakening that emerged from confinement. For Friedrich, these reflections reinforced a singular understanding: the human capacity to observe, to empathize, and to transform could not be confined by fences or ideology. The motif of light remained central to memory. Friedrich visualized the projector's beam slicing through night air, casting shadows and revealing faces, illuminating the interplay of thought, feeling, and observation. It had been more than cinematic illumination. It had symbolized moral clarity, the capacity to perceive complexity, and the subtle guidance toward ethical reflection. Each recollection of that light carried with it the sense of human potential, bridging confinement and freedom, routine and awakening, war and understanding. In conversations with family and neighbors, Friedrich found himself recounting scenes from camp life, small gestures of kindness, shared laughter during screenings, the quiet reflection of prisoners grappling with morality. The experiences were extraordinary, not because of danger or violence, but because of the subtle, transformative engagement with observation and thought. The ordinary had become extraordinary through immersion, reflection, and the careful cultivation of awareness. As he walked through a bombed street, Friedrich paused to watch sunlight reflecting off broken windows and scattered debris. He thought of the Texas nights, the projector's glow, the shared wonder, and the discussions that had begun to reshape understanding. The continuity between light and shadow, past and present, captivity and freedom felt tangible. He understood that the war's imprint, extended beyond physical destruction into the moral and emotional terrain of those who had survived, observed, and reflected. By late summer 1945, the slow rhythm of post-war life began to take hold. Friedrich Adler moved among relatives, neighbors, and returning soldiers, carrying with him the invisible weight of months spent in captivity. The lessons of observation, reflection, and moral awakening were never spoken outright, but they guided every gesture, every interaction. He noticed the small signs of human endurance: a child helping a neighbor carry firewood, a widow tending a damaged garden, a former soldier offering a reassuring word. Each moment echoed the quiet insights first glimpsed under the flickering projector light in Texas. Friedrich often revisited his sketchbook, the pages filled with lines, capturing not only the physical arrangement of the camp courtyard, but the emotions and transformations of the men within it. The beam of the projector, once literal, had become symbolic, a light illuminating moral awareness, empathy, and the capacity for ethical choice. He drew faces turned toward light, gestures of laughter and reflection, shadows stretching across sand, and realized that these moments, captured in graphite and memory, had shaped him as profoundly as any battlefield experience. Conversations with former comrades reinforced this understanding. They spoke not of escape or victory, but of observation, insight, and transformation. The films, the routines, the discussions, all had combined to create a moral and emotional awakening. Men described how they had begun to question orders, reflect on choices, and understand the humanity of others even in the midst of conflict. It was a quiet revolution of the mind and heart, one that endured long after the fences had disappeared and the trucks had carried them home. Friedrich walked along the edge of a ruined street, sunlight catching splintered wood and shattered glass. He thought of the courtyard, the evening air, heavy with dust and anticipation, and the projector's whirring hum. The juxtaposition of destruction and illumination was striking. In captivity, light had guided understanding. Now, in freedom, it illuminated possibility. The war had ended, yet the work of perception and moral reckoning continued, grounded in memory and reflection. The broader world, too, seemed to bear the imprint of these lessons. Returning POWs, once steeped in ideology, were quietly contributing to reconstruction, moral dialogue, and civic engagement. Letters and diaries recorded acts of cooperation, the sharing of resources, and the cultivation of empathy toward neighbors, allies, and even former adversaries. The capacity for moral reflection cultivated under captivity had not faded. It had traveled silently into the wider post-war world. As Friedrich paused to watch children playing among the ruins, he felt a sense of continuity. The projector's beam had once traced lines over faces, revealing fear, curiosity, wonder, and moral awakening. Now, those lessons were embedded in every gesture, every observation, every choice. He understood that captivity had not only restrained bodies, but had prepared minds to navigate complexity, to recognize the humanity in others, and to carry the fragile light of insight into the uncertainties of post-war life. The war had ended, cities lay in ruin, and the fences had been dismantled. Yet the transformation that began in a Texas courtyard, under the glow of a projector and the flicker of stories, persisted. Friedrich and his fellow prisoners emerged not merely as survivors, but as men who had been quietly guided toward empathy, reflection, and the enduring recognition of shared humanity. If this story moved you, subscribe to POW Tales, where every silence of war finds its voice again.